In the late 80s, up until sort of the midpoint of the 1990s, engine supply was kind of done based on what was available, how much it cost, and who was paying. Because back in those days, brand loyalty meant very little, and a lot of teams simply just took what they could get just so they could race. It meant that teams would seemingly change engine supplier every season just because of their financial situation. It also meant that by the time the mid-90s rolled around, there had been so many engine suppliers there was something for everybody, and the back of the grid teams went by cost rather than performance as they looked at any way of reducing their expenses, while similarly looking towards drivers with backing for their survival. The likes of Minardi spring to mind, but at least in Minardi's case, they ended up getting paid drivers who at least had a modicum of talent. But it's insane to see how many engine manufacturers were around in Formula 1 at some point over the course of the 90s. There's going to be the obvious ones, but there's some others in there too that won't be so obvious. Renault, Ferrari and Honda at the start of the decade. Peugeot and Lamborghini are two recent ones I've looked at, and then you've got Ford, Mercedes, Hart and then Arrows because Tom Walkinshaw bought out Brian Hart's company. You've also got Ilmor, Life with the ill-fated W12, Mugen Honda and Subaru. But you forgot, I hear you cry. Mechachrome, Playlife and Supertech are more rebadged 1997 Renaults, and Sauber's 1993 engines were just rebadged Ilmors. So it all depends on what your metric is. But there was another company on the grid between 1989 and 1997 that I've missed out. Yamaha. How is it that a company that also makes motorcycles and musical instruments got involved in Formula 1? Japan had been in a boom period around the time Yamaha entered the sport. It's probably why so many Japanese drivers and Japanese people got involved with Formula 1 at this time. You know, the likes of Leighton House, Footwork and so on, as well as the raft of Japanese paid drivers that came through, backed by the Mild 7 brand of cigarettes. But Yamaha wasn't exactly new to the world of car racing when it joined as a supplier in 1989, since they'd already got a decent record with supplying engines to Japanese Formula 2 and Formula 3000. But then they wanted to step it up. I can't find the confirmation, but maybe seeing Honda's success might have had something to do with it. So in 1988 they signed a deal with a small team operating out of West Germany called Zakspeed. Wow, West Germany. That seems like such a long time ago now. But anyway, Zakspeed was a team where if it got a result, it tended to be a fluke, and they did manage to score points at the 1987 San Marino Grand Prix when Martin Brundle scored their only points in the team's history. He somehow dragged that bucket of bolts to 5th, and he wasn't last on track either. The supply started in 1989 and, well, it wasn't exactly a season to remember. The engine was unreliable, and that's a word you're going to be hearing a lot through the next, 15 minutes or so? Zakspeed had been using their own turbocharged engine which was banned at the end of 1988, and the new 3.5 litre naturally aspirated formula was in. Yamaha had supplied Zakspeed with something called the OX66, a 75 degree, 5-valve, dual overhead cam V8 that put out around 600 horsepower, which at the time wasn't great. In one of those cars that year was Aguri Suzuki, only the second Japanese driver in F1 history behind Satoru Nakajima, and Aguri Suzuki is the Aguri in the Super Aguri team. I just love how the Japanese love putting super in front of stuff. Super Aguri, Super Formula, Super GT, Super Mario, but you have to think that Suzuki was there partly because of the Japanese engine connection. That said, Suzuki couldn't get the car out of the dreaded pre-qualifying session, a system that was abandoned in 1992 when the amount of cars on the grid dropped below 30, while Bernd Schneider could only make the grid twice and retired on both occasions. Schneider would be 5th in pre-qualifying at Jacarapagua, albeit 2 and a bit seconds behind Brundle and Modena in the Brabhams, who were by far the fastest cars in that group, and then managed to get the car onto the grid in 25th, 5.5 seconds off Senna's pole time. He made it 36 laps into the Grand Prix before he was involved in a collision with Eddie Cheever's Arrows, but at least the engine didn't go pop on him. The other time Schneider made the grid was at Yamaha's home Grand Prix at Suzuka, the 1989 Japanese Grand Prix known for other reasons than it being the only other time a Zakspeed made the grid that year, but by this time the pre-qualifying format had changed. Brabham, Dallara and Real had scored well enough in the opening half of the season to not have to pre-qualify for the rest of it, and they were replaced by Gabriele Tarquini's AGS and Roberto Moreno's Coloni. Onyx, Osella, Eurobrun and Zakspeed still had to pre-qualify, with Onyx still having to pre-qualify despite scoring 2 points. Minardi had scored 3 points at Silverstone, condemning Onyx to the pre-qualifying misery. 39 cars entered Grand Prix that year. It was madness. Schneider was third in pre-qualifying for Suzuka, only a second off the pace, although that's because the overpowered for the session Brabhams had gone now and been replaced by much slower cars. He'd then get onto the grid in 21st, 4.8 seconds off pole, and then his gearbox failed on the first lap. At the end of the season, both Zakspeed and Yamaha withdrew. Zakspeed went back to sports car racing in the twilight years of the Group C era, while Yamaha took a year out to make sure that the engine was better, and add 4 extra cylinders to it. At the 1991 United States Grand Prix, Yamaha was back, partnering this time with my boys at Brabham. The engine had evolved into a V12 rather than a V8, but the engine was still underpowered and unreliable. The old engine had about 600 horsepower, and the new one had 600 horsepower. The thing is, Yamaha at the same time was developing a more house-trained version of that engine. Using Brabham's old base at Chessington, Yamaha was hoping to build a road-legal sports car with a version of the F1 engine in it that had about 420 horsepower, a car that would have cost somewhere in the region of 500 grand, in 1992 money. With McLaren designing the F1 with Gordon Murray, Yamaha had brought in March co-founder Robin Hood as their Gordon Murray to try and piece it all together. The difference is, the McLaren made it to production and is one of the greatest supercars ever created. Yamaha's effort never went anywhere. The Japanese economy had gone into recession, with Yamaha having to decide whether to do the Formula 1 engines or the car. They chose the F1 engines. A fun fact, this V12 was modified and other bits and pieces done to it, and over the years it evolved into the engine that you will find in the Lexus LFA. Brundle and Blundell, which must have caused carnage with commentators, managed to do better with the Yamaha power than Zakspeed did. Not only did they qualify for every race apart from 3, they were also able to get top 10s, so long as the car worked. Brundle's Yamaha blew up at Canada, Blundell's blew in Mexico. Brundle's gearbox went at Manicourt, which, okay, maybe that's not Yamaha's problem, but Blundell suffered an engine failure at Silverstone. The 1991 British Grand Prix being the first after they ruined the circuit. Ruined it by adding the Bridge, Priory, Brooklands and Luffield section, and also the Maggots Beckett's S's. Oh, and Blundell blew another Yamaha at Barcelona. But they did also make the top 6, this being when only the top 6 scored, and were able to get a point for Blundell at Spa, and then Brundle got 2 at Suzuka. But Brabham's financial situation deteriorated at the end of the 1991 season. Going into 1992, they'd got Judd power instead of Yamaha power, so Yamaha needed another team to supply. Just after the Hungarian Grand Prix, Brabham collapsed and a historic team left the grid. So Yamaha was now going to be supplying Jordan for 1992. Jordan had managed to achieve something of a minor miracle in 1991 when they joined. They were a brand new team on the grid, but managed to score enough points to finish a respectable 5th in the Constructors' Championship, where other new teams that had come and gone in the previous 5 years had spent most of their time trapped in the pre-qualifying bubble and not really achieving much. But it all came at a price. Eddie had come in with about $12 million and ended the season several million in the hole. It was Bernie Ecclestone that convinced Eddie Jordan to take on the Yamaha engines, for the simple reason they would be free. That way, Eddie wasn't going to be spending as much money on engines and could then use sponsorship to try and build up his budget for 1993, where he could probably get some better engines. And it was clear that 1992 was going to be a struggle. The V12 from the Brabham was now in Eddie Jordan's car, which was mostly identical to the previous green machine that a certain Glenn Freeman loved so much, but had to be slightly longer to accommodate the extra 4 cylinders. Not only was this engine underpowered and heavy, being a big hulking V12, the 192 had been designed anticipating the Ford V8, so everything was a bit all over the place. And to make it even clearer as to how bad it was that year, look at these results. Modena couldn't qualify at South Africa, Barcelona, Hockenheim and Monza, so mostly power tracks, and didn't finish a race until Spa when he finished 15th. Mauricio Gugelmin retired at 11 of the 16 races, with most of the issues being engine or gearbox related. The team would get 1 single point at the Australian Grand Prix in Adelaide right at the end of the season. A race where, as a fun fact, Benetton became the first team since Lotus in 1963 to score points at every round of a season. So a disastrous season with Zakspeed and then another one with Jordan. Where was Yamaha going to go next? Tyrrell. That's where. Finally, Yamaha would develop a long-term working relationship with the team as Yamaha shrunk the engine down into a V10 and began to work with Ken Tyrrell. The OX10A that Yamaha developed for Tyrrell was now nudging the 700 horsepower mark, which was a marked improvement but still lagged behind the Renault offering, which was knocking out about 760 to 780 depending on spec and how much it had been turned up. So the car was still underpowered. The 020 that Tyrrell was running in 1993 was the C-spec and was now in its third year of service, so Tyrrell was dealing with an out-of-date car and an underpowered engine that only had about 10 horsepower more than the previous season. Tyrrell did bin the 020 off and replace it with the 021 after 9 races, but they could not score a single point. Now the season was marred by retirements. You're not going to get any prizes for guessing which part of the car was the main issue. Engine, gearbox and transmission. The usual stuff. Barcelona was the only round where something to do with the bits that make the car go forwards wasn't the reason the car retired. At Spa, De Cesaris had his engine blow up while Katayama in the sister car was 4 laps down on race winner Damon Hill. Katayama's engine also blew up at Suzuka. However, 1994 would be a significant upgrade. The team had an updated car in the 022, which does seem weird. They used the brand new 021 for less than half a season and then had a brand new one for the whole of 1994, but either way, it was worth it, because the 022 was a marked improvement for Tyrrell, but Yamaha still had reliability issues. The car struggled to finish races, but it scored more points. It might have scored even more points had the engine been more reliable. Katayama's engine went pop at his first home race of the season at Okayama. His gearbox went at Monaco while Blundell's engine went. Another engine failure for Katayama at Barcelona, while Blundell took advantage of a late Peugeot blow-up for Hakkinen to take Tyrrell's final ever podium. Gearbox issues for Blundell at Silverstone, and another Katayama engine failure in Belgium. Katayama's gearbox went in Portugal while Blundell's engine went in the pouring rain at Suzuka. The rest of the retirements are other mechanical issues, spins, or in Blundell's case at Hockenheim, being part of that Hakkinen pile-up at Turn 1. Tyrrell finished 7th in the Constructors that year, which was Yamaha's highest ever position as an engine supplier. 13 points was their best ever points haul, but it makes you think that they probably should have scored more points if the engine just held on. The thing is, the sea of retirements in 1994 for Tyrrell was high, even by 1994 standards. So when 1995 came round, it was almost business as usual, as the car turned up once again underpowered, and was as unreliable as it had ever been. The first half of the season was dismal, with Tyrrell's so-called Hydrolink suspension unable to be developed beyond its initial idea through lack of funding. And once Tyrrell got rid of it, the performance increased, but the engine still had its now customary downsides. Tyrrell had also made the cockpit size slightly higher for 1995, which didn't suit Katayama because he was much shorter than Salo was. Salo suffered from cramp in Brazil where he spun and lost time, and probably would have scored points without that. At Argentina, he was once again on for points but was punted off, but at San Marino, he suffered yet another Yamaha engine failure, before Katayama had the same problem in Spain. Gearbox issues hit Salo at Monaco while Ucchio lost another engine at Montreal. Katayama then had another engine failure in Adelaide, but Salo managed to score points in the final half of the season. The issue was, Tyrrell would score the same amount of points as Footwork in 1995, but because Footwork had scored a podium at the Australian Grand Prix, that put them above Tyrrell on the final standings. But because of this Hydrolink suspension that Tyrrell couldn't get working because of money and other bits and pieces, the problems performance-wise in 1995 weren't necessarily Yamaha's fault. 1996 would be the final season in which Tyrrell would use Yamaha engines. Tyrrell had managed to upgrade the 023 into the 024 that was so much of an upgrade, Salo quipped that they shouldn't be talked about in the same day. Yamaha upgraded the engine a little more, but it was still, as you've probably guessed, underpowered. And with Mugen Honda supplying Ligier, the battle of the Japanese engines in the mid-pack was going to hot up over the course of the season. The Renault in the Williams and Benetton cars could top out at about 780 horsepower. The Yamaha? Nowhere near that. And that's been a problem that's come up multiple times over the course of making this video, and that is the exact amount of power that different engines have been putting out. So I've just been going with what the ballpark figure is. So Renault is around 780 or so, but with Yamaha, some sources are saying 700 or 720, but others are saying 690. Either way, the Yamaha is regarded as being the second least powerful engine on the grid, behind the Ford engine that 40 was using. But Tyrrell designer Harvey Postlethwaite loved the engine. It was lightweight and more advanced over what Yamaha had given them before. In testing, Salo was doing decent lap times and then went into the Australian Grand Prix at Melbourne with some optimism. It was made even better when Salo finished 6th in Melbourne and then 5th at Interlagos, and claims he might have been on the podium if his engine hadn't let go while he was running in 5th at San Marino. But as is often the case with Tyrrell in the 90s, the development stopped because the money was running out. Yamaha had once again given them this engine that was not only underpowered, but unreliable. Joe Saward at GrandPrix.com was told by inside sources that year that Tyrrell had been through 50 engines by the time they arrived at the Belgian Grand Prix. The lack of power was so much of an issue for them that in qualifying for the German Grand Prix at Hockenheim, which was basically a 4-mile oval with a twiddly bit at the end in those days, Tyrrell sent Katayama and Salo out with 4 front tyres attached to the car. 2 front tyres at the front, which would be normal, and 2 front tyres on the rear to try and reduce drag. All because the Yamaha was so underpowered. The problem was, the Yamaha engineers had tried to apply some unique technology to the engines, and had been doing this for some time, but not at the level they'd been doing in 1996. The engine blocks were fine when they were initially machined, but when they got rebuilt, that's when the failures tended to creep in. The materials, which Yamaha wouldn't discuss at the time, were so fragile that when the engine was brand new, everything was cool, but they degraded so fast, it was becoming a problem. Tyrrell loved the free engines, but they also loved having power. There were rumours around the midpoint of 1996 that Ken Tyrrell was talking to Mugen about getting engines, and Mugen had recently powered Olivier Panis to a victory at the Monaco Grand Prix. Yamaha was convinced that they were going to get everything sorted out, but none of the teams were convinced, except for one. Arrows. Arrows was going all in for 1997. They'd signed Damon Hill, they'd got Bridgestone tyres which were brand new for that season, and they signed a deal with Yamaha to supply the V10s. With extra money coming in from Pedro Diniz, Walkinshaw seemed to have something in place for 1997 and was quite confident, thinking that Damon could win a race or two in 1997. Tom said it was up to Arrows to provide Damon with a reliable car to show what he could do, and prove that he wasn't just a newie merchant. Yeah, about that. Damon barely qualified in Australia and never made the start due to his car conking out before it could actually reach the grid on Sunday afternoon. Diniz was outside of the 107% but was allowed to race because Villeneuve's pole lap was so bloody quick. Hill's engine let go in Brazil, with both engines failing in Argentina. Pedro's gearbox failed at Imola, and both engines failed once again in Barcelona. The first time both cars would finish would be in Canada, when Diniz led Damon home 8th and 9th, with Damon 12th in France, and then got his first point of the season at home at Silverstone. Hill's engine once again blew at Hockenheim, and then got that second place at Hungary that was oh so close to a win, and it still hurts to talk about it even now. But by the midpoint of the season, Hill's reliability seemed to improve, and he was on the edges of the top 10, or inside the top 10. Under the modern points system, Damon would have had an okay 32 points from 17 rounds, which would put him around Hulkenberg and Tsunoda today. But it would be just the one single season with Arrows before everything changed again. Walkinshaw had bought Brian Hart's engine company and was going to rebadge those engines as Arrows, and Arrows would make their own engines similar to Ferrari. Yamaha, on the other hand, left F1 completely. Yamaha ended their time in Formula 1 with 113 race starts, 22 points, and not a single win to show for it. Moving around teams so much probably didn't help them either, and when they did start to show promise with Tyrrell in 1994, it kind of went backwards. But that wasn't necessarily Yamaha's fault, given that Tyrrell's new suspension wasn't properly working. Yamaha had seen Formula 1 as a showcase, because at the time they had a partnership with Ford and Toyota for road car engine development. They claimed that within 3 years, 3 years since 1996 that is, that we would start seeing things go over into the production engines that were going on with Ford and Toyota. But at the end of the next 12-month period, they were gone. Part of this was because Arrows wanted to build their own engines with Yamaha branding on them, while Yamaha wanted to supply their own stuff. It also led to discussion as to whether the engines were Yamahas at all in this time period. There was this belief that they were just Judd engines with Yamaha stickers on them, but this is something that just comes up from time to time. But after 7 years of making F1 engines, they were left with just a couple of podiums and not a single win, fastest lap, or a pole position. The only consistency these engines had was how underpowered they were, and how often they blew up. So then, a look through the history and stats and stuff of Yamaha engines in Formula 1. If this has been interesting for you, then do like the video so I know a good job was done, and for more from this channel, subscribe and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help keep the lights on around here or contribute to the picture purchasing piggy bank, a link to Patreon will be in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. There's also super thanks down there if you just want to buy me a coffee, and memberships for the whole Patreon without Patreon thing. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.